today to this wonderful event that is jointly sponsored by the School of Education and the Partnership for Public Education. I'm Kristala Musa, I'm the director of the School of Education, and I feel this event is really a testament to our commitment to community engagement and to really providing the supports we need to improve public education in Delaware and beyond. And we're very thrilled to have with us Dr. Malik today, who will discuss his new book on restorative practices. I think it's a special event for us in the School of Ed. Dr. Malik is actually a graduate of the School of Education. He received his Doctor of Education from our program, so it's a very special and proud moment for us to see our graduates and witness their successful journeys. I would also like to thank Dr. Payne, who would engage in a conversation with Dr. Malik. So again, I would like to welcome you. I know this would be an engaging and transformative conversation, and I hope you all enjoy. I'm going to turn the mic to Erin, who would actually share a few words about our guest speaker.
Oh man, I forgot. Hi everyone, I'm Erin Balger. I'm an assistant director with the Partnership for Public Education here at UD. As Kristala said, I just want to thank you all so much. A few quick thank yous, of course, to Dr. Payne for being here with us tonight. Thank you all so much for coming out, and particularly everyone from UD and so many of our P12 partners and our colleagues from DSU. Thank you all. The Partnership for Public Education is really inspired by a vision of meaningful cooperation and collaboration. And so whenever we have an opportunity to have an event like this, it really means a lot to us, and we thank you for sharing that vision. And in that spirit of connection, we hope that you stay with us after the talk and get something to eat, connect. There are books for sale in the back. There's some PPE materials, so we hope you'll stick around with us. Without further ado, I want to introduce you to my colleague and my friend, educator, scholar, activist, Dr. Malik Muhammad. As Kristala said, Malik is a graduate of the University of Delaware. He completed his doctoral degree here. He is also the founder and CEO of Transforming Lives, as well a founding team member and director of AquaBen, leading the charge for culturally responsive, trauma-informed restorative practice here in Delaware and beyond. And of course, he is the author of the tremendous book, The Restorative Journey. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Muhammad, Dr. Payne.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Greetings, Dr. Muhammad.
Greetings, brother.
All right, now, definitely a pleasure to connect and talk to you about, I think, a really timely issue, particularly as it relates to challenges that are related to our community. I definitely want to also thank you for the opportunity to really have a conversation with you about a very powerful and profound book. I think this issue of restorative justice and restorative practice, and we'll get in the distinction of those two, are really important in terms of the work that you and I do in the community. And I can honestly say that Dr. Muhammad is one of the few people that I know, particularly with a terminal degree, that's really on the ground, that's really working with folk and or populations that are vulnerable. And you are inspiration to a number of us out there. Thank you for always keeping me in mind, and thank you for inviting me to have this conversation with you.
Well, brother, thank you for your leadership as well. You know, we go back some years and some days, and Dr. Payne actually served on my doctoral committee, and he was an accountability partner along the way. So if you find yourself in a space where you have a soldier and a warrior that can actually support you the way that you have, then you're truly blessed. So thank you very much for being here, and thank you for all that you've done,
brother.
For me.
Cool. Let's get started. Dr. Muhammad, please tell us a little bit about yourself, right, before we get into your book. Where are you from? How did you grow up? How were you raised? Or what about your biography? What is it about your biography that actually connects to this timely concept of restorative justice? Or put more precisely, what is your restorative journey?
Yeah, it's so I think that's a good starting place. When I think about this work, I really think of and use the term journey a lot, right? So this process is not an event. You do not arrive at a place where you're restorative, right? If anyone says that I'm restorative, you know you're talking to someone who's not. So really, this is an idea of a journey, and so for me, that's really what I've thought of this process, right? My journey, and I first started thinking or hearing about the word restorative practices right around 2011, 2012. I tell the story in the book, but it was really a realization and nomenclature wrapped around practices and a way of thinking that was emerging for me. And so as I was serving young people here in Delaware and in places like Baltimore and Philadelphia, I was doing some things that I would find out later to be restorative. And that's really how most of us come to this work, that we are doing sometimes good work, sometimes really powerful work, and then we find out, damn, there's a name for this stuff. And that's pretty awesome. And that's really what was happening to me, that we were serving some young people, having some good connections, building relationships with them, having outcomes according to other people's metrics that matter to them. For us, it was really about saving lives. And we saw some really good outcomes there. And then we began to discover that this is really restorative practices, restorative justice. This is trauma-informed care. This is cultural relevancy, responsiveness, et cetera. And that's when I began to really think about this more, weaved it into the doctoral work. So now I was able to sort of wrap a framework around it that began to make sense. But I came out of college as an educator, and I started teaching in Southwest Philadelphia. Philly in the house. Philly is here. Yeah.
Oh,
all
really?
right.
Wow.
So,
Cool.
So if you know Philly, then you know Bartram High School. And I taught really, man. And so I taught at Tilden Middle School, right next to Bartram. And everyone here knows where I taught. You know Tilden Middle School because if you've ever seen The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, where he says, on the basketball court, that's where I spend most of my days. That was filmed at Tilden Middle School, and right on the basketball court. And so I cut my teeth in education in Tilden, and then I started teaching in Baltimore. And always with urban youth, always with black and brown communities, and really trying to find my way along the way. And eventually would settle in on practices that we could call restorative. When I was at my best, I was doing that work.
Cool,
Yeah.
cool. Restorative justice is understood and used in different ways,
Yeah.
depending on population, context. So schools, prisons, substance abuse and/or addiction, right? Restorative justice is tailored for that population. More specifically, how do you define restorative justice and restorative practice, given that you make a distinction between the two? And/or what populations are you chiefly thinking about when you use the term or the concept restorative justice?
Yeah. So I think for lay men and women, thinking and using restorative justice and restorative practices interchangeably makes sense. For those of us really in the field, we don't distinguish those. When you get into sort of academic circles or deep philosophical conversations, then those of us that are working in the fields of restorative justice, restorative practices, then we'll make some distinctions. For instance, restorative justice as a term sort of really began to emerge from the field of criminal justice, criminologists, right? And really thinking about how do we reconcile the challenges between victims and offenders. So largely in populations around criminal justice, incarceration, right? Criminal justice in that area. And then, you saw some folks in the 70s or so really that weren't working in that field, but how does this apply to places like education and community? And so they began to popularize restorative practices. So there's some that would say that for those that are steeped in the restorative justice sort of field, then it would say that restorative justice is the umbrella and restorative practices emerges underneath that. And those that are in restorative practices will say that restorative practices is the umbrella and restorative justice emerges under that. Quite honestly, we're doing the same kind of work, and those of us that are serious about it are really thinking about it in the same ways. So for our purposes, let's not distinguish between restorative practice and restorative justice. I think, though, when we think about the work, whether it's restorative practices or justice, 80% of the work really needs to be thought of as proactive. And that's really different than how we think of restorative practices. For instance, you go into schools that are just emerging in this process, and they'll say, yeah, I do restorative practices, and they think of it very narrowly defined. For instance, when a young person has done something wrong and they're responding to harm, then they'll call that restorative practices, but not the 80% of the real positive, proactive work around building social capital, around building community, all of the work that we do in lieu of maladaptive negative behavior, right? So all of the positive things that we do to build community really fall in the bucket of restorative practices and justice. So to define it, I give an academic definition in the book because I don't want anyone to doubt my credentials. So I'm going to save that for the book. I think the best way that I think of restorative practices, restorative justice, is this real truism, and that is that human beings change their behavior based on their bonds and relationships.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
I'll say that again because it's that important. Human beings change their behavior based on their bonds and relationships. So if you believe that to be true, that human beings, that we are social beings, that we change our behavior, that our behavior is mitigated, regulated, directed by our bonds and our relationships, then what restorative practice and restorative justice do is how do we activate those bonds and relationships to help positively transform behavior prior to harm being done and after harm has been done. So how do we use and leverage those relationships? There's a formula that I share in the book and I've been trying to popularize out there, and it's a really simple formula, and that is that connection plus challenge equals change. Connection plus challenge equals change. So we build a currency by connecting that we use to challenge. And oftentimes, and that ultimately leads to change. So what we often do is we violate that formula. For instance, if we look at the complex or challenging relationship between law enforcement and communities of color, particularly the Black community, right? What we have is a violation of that formula. We have those that are coming in to challenge, command and control, and they lack a connection, right? And so therefore you have resistance by the community. And sometimes, if we're being honest, sometimes we have a deep and profound connection in the community that we don't challenge each other enough, right? And so therefore we end up having sometimes a violation of that formula. So restorative practices for me is really connection plus challenge equals change. It's the activation of that. It's the practicing of that formula.
Nice. Cool. Can you talk to us a little bit about your company, AquaBen, and Transformative Lives, excuse me. And so the mission, the vision of these companies, and how restorative justice as a principle is at the heart of the companies.
Yeah. Back in 2012, I was being asked to serve some local school districts here in Delaware and really share some of the things that we were doing in our alternative schools, the alternative environment. For the past 10 or so years, I've been working in alternative schools and alternative space. And so they were asking us to come and share some of these thoughts. And so I needed an organizational vehicle, and I formed an organization called AquaBen. AquaBen is an ancient Adinkra symbol from West Africa, and it symbolizes a war horn. And I couldn't think of a better way to sort of build the philosophical foundation of an organization around than a war horn that calls the community to come out and serve. And so AquaBen is a professional development and training organization. And Transforming Lives is our direct service organization. So it's Transforming Lives where we run our schools. So I have an alternative school in Newcastle that rolls through the umbrella of Transforming Lives. We have other programs that are pushed into schools that are really rooted inside of Transforming Lives. So the idea is that our programs, direct service programs affecting youth in Transforming Lives are the laboratory, right, and the breeding ground by which we hone, fine-tune, and really sharpen our analysis that we share in AquaBen. So those two are really sister organizations.
Got you. With that in mind, right, given the work that we do, the populations that we serve, can you talk a little bit more pointedly in terms of how race, ethnicity, culture informs restorative justice and or the restorative journey?
Yeah. So those of you who know Dr. Payne knew this one was coming, right? Because the brother is going to make sure that I stay honest. So there are too few of us in the field of restorative practices, and I would say really in trauma-informed care as well. that are explicitly making a connection to culture and to race.
Yes, sir.
Right? For instance, I find it to be an anathema, really a challenge that one could be trained in restorative practices and having left that training without talking about race or culture explicitly, or power or bias or oppression, right? And so what we pledge to do is not do that. So if one comes through one of our trainings, if they're participating in our process, if they're reading the book, then we are going to make clear explicitly that there's a connection here to race and to culture. We're going to use that in the form of, in education, we're going to talk about discipline and disproportionality, right? Then we're going to talk about the invisible and explicit curriculum, right? If we're talking about the community, we're going to talk about structural violence, right? We're going to talk about oppressive systems. We're going to talk about patriarchy and bias and privilege. And so restorative practices is not a cute thing that we can implement in order for us to get along better, right? That is at best a misuse of a very powerful process and tool. And I think for too long, good-hearted, good-natured white folk have used it as such, right? And I think that what we have a responsibility to do, those of us that are serious about this work, that really link restorative practices, restorative justice to revolution, have a responsibility to make it very plain and clear that this is really about changing the very structure of society and not putting Band-Aids on those structures.
I hear that.
And if we're serious about this work, then that's what it's going to ask of us, right?
Sure.
And so it's not how do we teach young people and the rest of us to accept harm and maybe speak on it a little bit, right? But let's talk about the harm that happens on the playground and talk about the harm that's coming from the White House, right? And let's talk about conditions of oppression that are affecting women, right, and people of color, the LGBT community, all of that. Let's make sure that we're speaking that truth to power in this process.
Cool. Yeah. All right, let's shift gears just a little bit. Let's talk about Senate Bill 85 in Delaware. So we hear a lot about the school-to-prison pipeline and the prospect of restorative practices, disrupting that pipeline. Last year, the Delaware legislature passed SB 85, which seeks to reduce the frequency of exclusionary discipline and the disproportionality of that discipline. And to quote from the bill, Department of Education data shows that in 2013, Black American students made up only 32% of the student body, but accounted for 62% of out-of-school suspension, and students with disability made up 13% of the student body, but accounted for 24% of out-of-school suspensions. SB 85, in addition to requiring a thorough counting of discipline, data, and policies, this bill also calls for an increase in restorative discipline interventions, in quotes. Do you know to what extent a restorative justice model is being used currently to reduce exclusionary discipline in Delaware? And if so, what are your thoughts about the Department of Education's use of restorative justice models in public schools with low-income Black children?
Yeah, so, I don't think we have metrics around the extent of Delaware schools, right, to the degree in which they're using restorative practices as interventions in lieu of suspension, right? And I think that that's a really important way to narrowly think about this, right? So, SB 85 was designed to decrease the number of suspensions. Right? And that is important because what I've already said is that 80% of the work around restorative practices and justice is in the proactive, right? And not necessarily a response and therefore a reduction to out-of-school suspensions specifically. And so while I think we can't necessarily put metrics, I don't have metrics around the extent of the use, what I do know is that we are working with many districts in Delaware. Some range from a very light touch at best sort of a compliance piece, right? Where, folks will be called in to do a training and it's a one and done. And then there's others that have really taken a very serious look at how they can implement this to change the culture of their district, right? And so we see them across the gamut, and we also see charters that are on that same process, right? And so I would say that Delaware is emerging in various districts in this way. I'm challenged, though, because on the one hand, discipline, disproportionality, and the school tourism pipeline and how it affects particularly boys of color, girls of color, and some students with special needs, and how we need to intentionally deal with that. I'm also very concerned about implementing restorative practices in a non-restorative way.
What do you mean by
right? And what I mean by that is that restorative practice is not something that you mandate, right? Restorative practice is something that you develop, that you learn, that you walk people on this journey, right? That you implement it in a restorative way. And so therefore to legislate, right, that you're going to build relationships, right? We already know, right? Right? So
Yeah.
it's that idea of, beatings will continue until morale improves, right? And so I'm challenged by that. I was challenged by the bill when it was written, by support of it. And while I think its intentions are correct, I worry about its implementation. So what we have is school districts that are pushing back and say, okay, you want me to do this restorative stuff? Then fine. They will engage in what Stephen Covey calls malicious obedience, which means that I will implement for the sake of compliance, but I don't really mean it. Right? And so that's what we end up having in some environments. And so what we will have, I believe, is the beginnings of inching in the metrics that matter and are captured by some, but not necessarily meaningful change in the lives of young people. And I think that that's where it is going to require us to shift the paradigm into how we even think about this work. This is not an alternative to suspension. This is really a way of which how we, this is how we can be in this thing called school. Right. So.
Let's get underneath that a little bit more. Let me push just a little bit more, right? Given that you've agreed that race matters, culture matters, gender matters, right? Given that race matters, and given that most school personnel, most school teachers, right, are white Americans, particularly those teachers over low-income Black and brown students, right? So something like 85 to 90% of school teachers, particularly over low-income Black children, are white middle-class women, right? And not to mention you have a mostly white administration. And given that race matters in terms of the implementation of this restorative journey, right? So would you agree or would that in some way play a role in terms of the tension, in terms of the pushback between schools and implementing restorative justice? Does race matter in this dynamic?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does. So what we found in our organization is working with some school districts that are really challenged in their own journey and their geography around blatant issues of racism, right, and racist attacks, right? Whether it's, dirty Mexican is written on one's locker, right, or frequent use of the N-word, right, in the school and sort of accepted as part of just culture of our school. And so in those environments in particular, what we found is when we have come in to really, when we're called in, right, to do a training on cultural diversity, responsiveness, et cetera, there is this level of defensiveness, which in our restorative practices model, we link to shame. Right, so in the book we talk about shame and the compass of shame, and there's a chapter on that, and sort of decidedly, determining that shame is really what is existing here. Then it allows us to humanize even those folks that don't act like human in the moment, right? And so when one is experiencing shame, and because they're being confronted with something like the Harvard implicit bias test. Right, I remember doing a training and folks had taken the online Harvard implicit bias test, and they were pushing back because what it revealed was that they really had an implicit bias favoring those of their particular race, and they were pushing back and like, hey, yeah, this is BS. I don't believe it. And I kind of said, hey, listen, yeah, I see what you're saying. Those folks at Harvard don't seem to know what they're talking about, right? And really sort of challenging the psychometrics around that because they were having a shame moment. And so where culture and race and ethnicity and gender, I think, interplay is that we can understand some of those dynamics using a restorative paradigm. For instance, the social discipline window gives us a window and a framework by which we can understand some of that. And then also what we can do with building social capital is it allows us the groundwork and foundation by which to have the more tougher conversations. What we learned as an organization is we needed to have a foundation of restorative practices and a restorative conversation to allow for us to begin to push deeper. We were going for the tough issues, and people weren't ready. And what we were experiencing was shame. And we need for them to be ready because God knows our children do. And so we need to hasten the pace of implementing restorative practices so we can get people ready.
Okay, you touched on the social discipline window. I definitely want to let's talk a little bit more about some more dimensions that you are drawing on, main dimensions of your restorative model. I want to talk about the box, right? 56 to 58, and you have these 4-part boxes, the not box, the 2 box, the 4 box, right? And we need to be, according to your argument, we need to be in the with box.
Yeah.
Can you clarify for us what are these boxes and what is it about the with box that grounds your restorative model?
Yeah, absolutely. So the social discipline window is our preeminent model, right? So I dare say that no one understands restorative practices without understanding the social discipline window, right? So if you go to no other pages, go to the pages that you cited because it's just that important, right? And so we spend a lot of time on that in training. But I think a good way to lead into that is, I've now asked, I think my number is somewhere around 8,000 people across 4 continents. And I've asked them this question, and I'll ask you all, and that is, think of a person who had a positive influence in your young life. Someone who had a positive influence in your young life, right? And then think of one word to describe that person. One word to describe that person. And when I've asked people to do that, and they share their one word, words like loving, caring, present, right? Someone who was dynamically there, right? Unwavering, all of that. What's really interesting is that no one used, in 8,000 people, and we went around the room here, probably none of you, in 8,000 or so people, no one used their one word to describe the person physically, right? No one used their one word. Now, some draw an incorrect conclusion there, right? Because then they'll say, because the physical doesn't matter. Those are often, that's in that same vein that says things like, I don't see color, right? And please, if you've ever said that BS, stop saying it because it is very offensive, right? To many people. And if you don't understand why it's offensive, you need to, you're here at UD, do some reading. And so, because it really is that easy to figure out. And so, what's more important is, let's think about the word that you chose, right? Loving, caring, dynamic, etc. I asked you to describe the person, and you described how they treated you. I asked you to describe the person, and you described how they showed up in your life, right? Specifically, probably, how they used their authority with you. So what does this have to do with the social discipline window? Social discipline window is a 2x2 matrix that is an intersectionality of challenge and connection, right? And so the not box is low challenge, low connection, right? Those are the individuals that the way that they show up is not showing up at all. They're the absentee landlords in your life. They're the classroom teacher that would rather be on vacation than teaching, right? They're the community member or community leader that only shows up when they're being recognized on the podium, right? And is not really there, right? So that's the not box because these folks are not present, they're not engaged, they're certainly not effective. And then you have the high challenge and low connection. And those are folks that are in that 2 box, TO. And that is because they use their authority by doing things to people, right? It's my way or the highway. It is my program. Your responsibility is to fall in line or fall down. I know that box well because that is primarily where I spent most of my career as a teacher, as an administrator, as a principal, as a parent. And so it's that box of dominance and control, right? And then, of course, you have the other side of that is high connection and low challenge. And that is, we don't ask very much of folks except to give us hugs and to give us love, right? And that is that I will do things for you. So we call it the 4 box, F-O-R, because you are doing all the heavy lifting for someone, primarily because you don't believe that they can do it themselves. So you operate from a lack of faith. So I'm going to do the work for you because I don't believe that you can. So if you're quiet long enough, then I'll give you the answers, right? If you refuse to take out the trash long enough and you're my child, then I'll end up taking it out for you. I might mumble under my breath, but at the end of the day, I'm going to make excuses for you, right? And then the with box is really that high connection, and high challenge. And I don't have to give an example, you already have one, and that's that person who was that positive influence in your young life.
That's right.
Right? That's that person who you couldn't just do whatever you wanted to. You knew that they would hold you accountable,
right.
but yet they were there for you. You knew that they would have your back, right? That they would defend you in your absence, and that's that with box. So the social discipline window, really, I mean, that's, sort of 1.0 version, right? And it goes so much deeper, because what does gender have to do with this? What does race have to do with this?
Right.
Critical questions like, in a place of oppression, right? Can white folks be in the with box, right? In a place of oppression and privilege, can men be in the with box? Right? Those are the critical questions that I think those of us that are in this process need to think about and challenge ourselves with.
Wow. Yeah, nuanced, really a nuanced discussion on restorative justice. A really delightful read, right? And in between a number of his discussions and/or nuanced discussions on restorative justice, Dr. Muhammad, right? He has these passages throughout the book where, he's entitling them travel notes from the journey. So there are several travel notes from the journey strewn throughout this book. And let me read from one of them, right? Imagine for a moment that you knew a young man named Damien who was mad at the world and acting out in ways that appeared to be maladaptive and self-defeating. What if you understood why Damien was so angry? What if your connection and your relationship with Damien helped you to understand his relationship with the institutions that were supposed to, but failing to serve and help him? What if you learned of the negative impact of those variables through your connection and relationship with him? You could then challenge his thinking around those variables because of your connection and your relationship with him. Imagine if you challenged him at age 16 to stop raging internally and acting out externally. Imagine if you challenged him to change the things he could not accept in the world and become an activist. Imagine if you challenged him to change himself and the world. Can you talk to us a little about who Damien is, and can you talk to us a little bit about Damien's transformation?
Yeah, so Damien was the hardest young person that I ever worked with. He had there's something that we use in trauma-informed care called ACEs, and that's adverse childhood experiences, right? And if you do any work in trauma-informed care, you'll come across the ACEs. And when you think about Damien, right, he had a bunch of ACEs, right? And what we know is that 2/3 of us have at least one ACE, and then if you have one, you're much more likely to have more, right? And a shout out now to the greatest trauma-informed expert that I know, and that's Dr. Christina Watlington, right there. She is a seminal expert on trauma-informed care and taught me everything that I know, and that is only a fraction of what she does. And she's also my wife, y'all. I have the privilege of being her husband, really. It's more like that, right? So she's bad, boy, she's bad. And so Damien was the toughest young person that I had ever met, and was really steeped heavy into a real wounded life. And Damien is the name that I was born with. So, his story is really mine. And when I think about this idea of journey, that is a perfect way to really think about Damien, right? Because Damien / Malik / the other names that I've had are still on this journey of becoming and evolving and trying to really make sense of this thing called life and where we're going to fit, where I'm speaking for myself like I dissociative identity disorder, where I am going to fit, right? In it. You see, y'all, that's another benefit of being married to a psychologist, that I can name my disorder, right? From the DSM-5. And so, sort of where I fit in the world, right?
Right.
And so this restorative journey is really deeply rooted in my early life under the name Damien, partly because I saw what the machinery of institutions, that institutional betrayal, right? That I went to school, and school was not a place where I fit in and found value, and they didn't find value in me, and I didn't find value in it.
Right.
And what my early life was, and I talk about this in the next book, but my early life was really what Du Bois said in 1906 in The Soul of Black Folk, right? He said, between me and the world, there's an ever unasked question, unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, unasked by others by not knowing how to rightly frame it. But the question is always there, and that is, how does it feel to be a problem? And that's what I really felt as a young person. I was a problem. I was a problem to my family, to my community, to my school, and to myself. And along that way, I was finding markers and people that were helping me. And that would eventually lead me to making some decisions in life that were largely influenced by others, shaping me along the way, and emerged.
Right.
Yeah, emerging.
So when do you go from being Damien to being Malik, if I may ask?
Yeah, well, you know,
Because I would assume that it's also a spiritual transformation.
Yeah. Part of it, right? So I was born. I don't share this with a lot of folks, but I was named after my white grandfather in Maine, who was not named Malik, and that shouldn't be a surprise. And so, but his name was Arnold, right? Arnold. And but by 10, I knew that Arnold wasn't going to get me where I wanted to be in the world, right? No offense to folks named Arnold. But my mother had the foresight, or maybe lack thereof, to name her son the middle name Damien. And yes, those of you who know sort of religious tradition, Damien is the name of the son of the devil. And that's exactly how I acted, right? So at 10 years old, I went by Damien, and 10 years old, it happened to coincide with the first time that I was arrested, right? And I was arrested at 10, yeah. Wow. And would spend a lot of time between 10 and 14 in juvenile detention centers and alternative schools. By the time I was in 9th grade, I had gone to 11 different schools. Get out of here. So there was a lot of turmoil, transition, exclusion, right, in my life. But by about 14, 15, I was really yearning for some kind of transformative process or event. And so I changed my religion. I took my Shahada and I became Muslim. And I quietly started thinking of myself as Malik. And then eventually I'd go on, be the first person in my family to go to college. I would meet an amazing young woman, and she would quicken that process because I really liked her. I think she was digging me too, and really she had no room and acceptability for Damien. And so Damien needed to get gone, and so Malik emerged. And thank God for Christina Watlington. And so really since then, really thinking of myself in a different way. Wow. Reimagining.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Really appreciate that, brother. Number of personal stories in this book. I love how you weave it in and out of your more intellectual discussion. You share a story of teaching your daughter, Miss Ngozi, who I had the pleasure of having in class as well. But you share a story in your book about Ngozi, in terms of riding her bike, and a story that's familiar to many families, but you offer up the phrase, putting training wheels on it, right? In quotes, right? To kind of capture the notion of support and challenge, which are central to restorative practices. Can you take us through this story? Yeah. And how this story helped you to develop your restorative model? Yeah,
and just a note on stories that throughout the book and a lot of the training that we do, we use the vehicle, the mechanism of stories. And there's an African proverb that goes something like, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, then a story is worth 1,000 pictures, right? That facts speak to our head and stories speak to our heart. And so I really believe that, so we use stories a lot, right? Stories are just a really powerful way to teach and also to explore what's going on with us and to make sense of our own world and narrative, right? So the one that I do like is the one where I tell the story of teaching my daughter, Ngozi, who's our oldest, how to ride a bike in Baltimore. And so we're out behind our home, and it's a good flat area, and so it's a great place, to teach someone how to ride a bike. And so she comes out, and I'm putting training wheels on her back tires, and she's naturally inquisitive, and so she was asking me, why do we have training wheels? What are these training wheels for? And so I explained to her, right, that this would give you the opportunity to be able to ride a bike on your own. And so we were out there working hard at it. And my daughter is a proud, powerful African woman, just like her mother. And so she really wanted to get it. So we stayed out there for a long time. And she was getting it. And what was clear, though, was that the training wheels allowed her to have forward momentum. And I'm not talking about just moving forward. I'm saying psychologically to be able to do the thing that she needed to do, and that was to ride her bike, right? So the training wheels didn't do the riding for her, but it really provided the support,
right.
i.e., right, connection plus challenge equals change, right? That the challenge was riding the bike. The training wheels themselves provided the support. I was out there as the connector, right, and connecting with her, but also to say, you can do this, let's go, right? Connection plus challenge equals change. And so when we think about this work, what I think we have a responsibility to do is not to violate good learning theory. In other words, as you're teaching people about restorative practices, let's think about the same way that we teach young people how to do math, or we teach them how to do, how to understand science. We practice good learning theory in which we put training wheels on them for people, right? So one challenge that I have, i.e. going back to SB 85, right, is that we have a responsibility to not just mandate, you must do this, because what is you must do this but the same punitive process in disguise?
Right.
Right? So what the punitive process does is say, you must do this, otherwise I'm going to do something to you, right? What the training wheels philosophy does is say, you have a responsibility to do this. We've determined this is something important, right? So how are we going to create this and give meaning to it?
Cool. Can you talk to us real briefly about Travis, another one of your stories, and or how Travis also informed your restorative model?
Yeah, so I was the principal of an alternative school here in Delaware, and I was just really beginning some of this work around restorative practices. And one thing that, one of the practices is using affective language, and that's really increasing your emotional vocabulary to be able to explain what's going on with you and how one's behavior impacts you. So one thing that we use is an affective statement, and an affective statement is easily defined as it's an I statement that expresses emotion and it's connected to behavior. For instance, I am overjoyed and honored that you all came out tonight, right? So that's an affective statement, an I statement that expresses emotion connected to behavior. And that seems easy enough, except for those of us that are pretty emotionally immature, right? Especially those of us that, happen to be blessed with a gender that is socialized to not use our emotional vocabulary, right? And so, in being a leader that was heavy into the two box, i.e., you do what I tell you to do, right? Because I told you to do it, you're here in my house, right? My school, which is the kind of leader that I was. And so one day I was heading on the middle school floor. I looked down the hallway and I saw a teacher outside of his classroom. And as soon as he saw me, he scurried into his classroom. Now, if you are a pre-service teacher or you want to become a teacher, never do that, right? If you see your principal, please never make eye contact with your principal and then run away. Like I promise you it's not going to go well, right? And so it didn't go so well, right? Because I immediately decided I was going to go to his room. And so I'm halfway down the hallway, and I hear this voice yell out, and I'll clean up the language, but he essentially says, I don't give an F about Mr. Muhammad, right? And so I recognized the voice. It was the voice of a young man named Travis, who I knew well. And so I get to the room, and I would find out later that Travis had just watched Kevin Hart. He had just seen he had gotten a bootleg version of Kevin Hart, so he now had access to Kevin Hart before anyone else did. Therefore, he was going to ruin the joke for everybody. And so he's in the room and he's, telling kids, "Oh, you're going to learn today. All right, all of that stuff, right?" And so that's what I would find out later on. But all I heard was, I don't give a F about Mr. Muhammad. I get to the room. Everyone has their attention on me now, except for Travis. He's got his back to the door. And then quietly he begins to realize that he's lost his audience. Kids aren't laughing anymore now because here's the principal who is steeped heavy in that two box about control, about punishment, filling up the door frame. And so Travis slowly turns around, and I describe it in more detail in the book, and he eventually recognizes that his life is in danger. I mean, he's in trouble, right? And so I ask him to come to me, and come to the hallway. And he's got a few seconds, and he kind of does what we call the prison shuffle, right? Where he's sort of like, he's slowly moving to his fate. And in those few seconds, I now have to make a decision, because I was well versed in the language and the methodology of punishment, but I was not well versed yet in the methodology of restorative practices. And so I needed to decide in that moment, what was I going to do? Was I going to go into my default, which I was very used to doing, or was I going to try something new? And I decided in that moment to use an affective statement, an I statement that expressed emotion, connected behavior. And so Travis comes to the door and he's like, oh, I'm sorry, my bad, I didn't mean to disturb class, etc. I didn't mean to curse in your school. All of those things that he was using in order to mitigate his punishment, right? If he said enough, that would mitigate the kind of punishment and severity of the sanction. And that's when I said, hold on, I just need to let you know that I am hurt and I'm sad that you would say that you don't give an F about Mr. Muhammad. Because I would never say that about you, Travis. And that took a lot because I wanted to say some other things to Travis, right? I wanted to show him how much I cared about him, right? Using my behavioral vocabulary and not my emotional vocabulary. But he was dumbfounded and he was caught off guard because here was an alpha male using language that he was not used to and being vulnerable in a way that he was not used to.
Right.
And so, we had him go to the reflection room in order for him to kind of process some of the things. But what I asked him and I required of him is, at the end of the day, we're going to come back because we need to understand what happened and also be in right standing because you're not in right standing now. Right. And the report that I had gotten from his teachers was that this generally verbose young man was relatively quiet throughout the day and more self-reflective. We came back together at the end of the day along with his teacher. He made amends. We talked about what was going on. And at the end of that conversation, this young man said the most amazing thing that a young person has ever said to me. And he said, Mr. Muhammad, I just want you to know that I really do give a F about you, right? And I damn near cried, right? Because that was the very best that he had using his language, right? And I understood exactly where he was coming from, right? And I gave him a hug and we were good. So he means a lot to me. Yeah,
wow,
yeah.
Wow. Like I said, there's a number of powerful stories like that in the book. I'm going to push back a little bit. I'm going to ask some more, tougher questions about this concept of restorative justice. As you and I have spoken, you know my perspective anyway. You know my theory, the work that I do in the community, the perspective. And like any good theory, any good concept, it has strengths and limitations, right? So, but I do want to talk about the elephant in the room as it relates to this concept, right? So I have a few questions, but let me just open up by asking this. Are we really talking about, right, so we're talking about restorative justice and we're talking about bringing folk back into good standing, right? What does that actually mean? Are we talking about assimilation or are we really talking about transformation, right? This argument of restorative practices. Is this really about challenging and disrupting systems? Or is this about figuring out how to get people to work within systems? Are we really talking about change, right? Or are we really talking about, maintaining and people and/or within a context of cultural norms, right? So let me just end by saying it this way. Is it possible to work within established systems to create authentic restorative practices and disrupt traditional punitive practices?
Yeah. It's Dr. Payne, y'all. Right. So I believe where restorative practices, certainly restorative practices in its current iteration, right? And to some degree, restorative justice. And here's where I begin to differentiate, right? What we do know is that our colleagues and warriors that think of themselves in restorative justice lean heavy into social justice, lean towards and with conversations explicitly around privilege, right, and bias, right, and tapping in and privileging indigenous voices, right? This is powerful. This is a wonderful contribution that they make. And those that live and have lived primarily in the area of restorative practices have not necessarily pushed hard enough in that. And so I think in its current iteration as a field, it has largely been more Band-Aid than revolution, right? And as such, too often it can be aligned with some of the backward ideas of those that are pushing and big proponents of things like grit, for children,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so, for instance, the problem that I have with grit is not about resiliency, is not about perseverance, because we know, as you document so well in your work, is that we don't have to teach young people on the street how to be resilient. These cats come to us already resilient, right? By definition of their very being, right? That they're resilient. So we don't need to try to increase their grittiness, right? All that, get more gritty. No, we don't have to do that, right? In fact, if you are in positions of power and you are not trying to change oppressive conditions, then what grit means is grin and bear it, right? And we're not interested in that at all. Nor, I think, the intellectually inept conversations that are pushed on many levels, there's backwardness here, but people like Bill Cosby and some others that are about no excuses, right? Like, you know, black folks and brown folks just deal with adversive, oppressive conditions and then, you know, just deal with it, right? That is just called life, right? So I'm not saying, so we need to abandon those philosophies. So what can we do around the restorative process to make it more revolutionary? I think that as we're really engaging in this work and we're being more explicit around culture, restorative practices and justice is irreconcilable with the kind of hierarchical structures that exist in Western society now. For instance, right, when we think about what does it mean to be restorative, right, and build social capital, build connectedness, and decrease harm and resolve harm, right? How does that jive at all with capitalism?
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
How does that jive at all with white supremacy? Right?
Yes,
and
sir.
so when we're very serious about the work, then I think that we begin, it inherently calls into questions some of the principles of Western society, right, that will become irreconcilable. So those that play at being restorative will find themselves getting into something that they're not even ready for. So good, let's go there.
Right.
Right? So that's where I really think that we need to push more on. And so that's what, you know, in the last chapter of the book, I talk about where do we go from here, right? And the first thing I talk about is we need to marry restorative practices with social justice and anti-racism, right? And we need to marry restorative practices into revolutionary action. That's really what I think is important.
Okay, let's push a little bit more though, right? Structural violence, revolutionary kinds of practices. I think this is a very important conversation. And I think, you know, as you've already said, this is the problem with a lot of theories, Western-based theories that are used, right, to understand and work with low-income black and brown populations, right? There becomes at some point a mismatch, right? So we live in a capitalistic society that requires economic poverty, right? And black and brown populations disproportionately, right, hold or sustain that position of poverty so that all of us can enjoy our privilege in this nice warm room, right? So what does restorative, right, practice mean in the context of that? Right? So, you know, help us reconcile the reality, the necessity of structural violence and restorative justice, right? So many men and women engage in crime, right, as a way to deal with economic poverty, right? They're going to transgress. It's inherent to the hustle on someone at some point, right? There will be a victim and a victimizer, right, as part of the hustle, right? And most of these folk, these are poverty crimes, including the violence. Right? And their poverty is necessary, once again, so that we can have this moment, right? So if that is true, then what does restorative justice mean, right? What do we say to that young man or that young woman when we're trying to help them reconcile their differences? Does this simply become a conversation about resolving cognitive and emotional imbalance, right? And or at what point do we help them to understand what is really going on?
And admittedly, we haven't reconciled this yet, right? And I think the core questions that you're asking is sort of how do we, to what extent is our challenges and harmful behavior, right? Caused by, influenced by that which is external, right, and that which is internal. And I don't know if even that binary or juxtaposing it that way as I'm describing the argument is really even what you're saying. But what we do know, and I think a place where we can agree is that even when dealing with adverse conditions and my behavior is in response to structural violence and oppression, that I can still cause harm to those that I love. right? That I can still cause harm to those that didn't deserve it, right? And in that process, how do we reconcile that without causing more harm? Right? And so, for instance, the young men that are left behind when their fathers go into the plantation or in prison, right? Then that is harm that is caused, right? And having a better global understanding and macro understanding of the conditions which created Pops to go inside, right? And how he was responding to that and trying to take care of what he needed to is one thing, but on a very intimate level, when I'm 5 years old, Pops, I need for you to be here. Right? And the harm that was caused, and how does Pops get in good standing and back in good standing with his son, with his daughter, with those family members that he's caused harm to, right? And so this is also part of, if it, the idea is, that, sort of the popularization of African proverb of it takes a village to raise a child, right? Well, who repairs the village? And that's really what I think part of this is, right? And also we know from African culture that if there is no enemy within, then the enemy without cannot hurt me. And so that's really what I think we're talking about here. And as men, and especially black men, that we are well-versed in the language of challenge and punishment. We're not well-versed in the language of love, right, and compassion with each other. And I think that what we have to do is really begin more attuned in that emotional vocabulary. And I'm not talking about the soft stuff, right? I'm really talking about how do we figure out to work through and process the shame that even the hardest among us feel, right, when they've done something that causes harm to those that didn't deserve it. I'm talking about even in their own family. How do we reconcile that and be on good standing with each other?
Okay, cool.
But I think aluta continua, right? The struggle continues with you and I, right? Yes. I mean, because I think we got to figure that out.
Yeah, I mean, because young men that you work with, that I work with, at the end of the day, if definitely we need them to heal, right? We need to work with them. We need to show them different ways of dealing with their challenges. But oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes, what they're dealing with is much bigger than them, right? Woofy, who we know, Darryl Chambers, he often refers to what's going on in the communities as structural genocide, right? The intentional decimation of our people, right? And then, right, you and I, even in good faith, people like you and I turn around and we say, well, hey, even if we don't do it the Bill Cosby way, we still are asking them to pull up, their bootstraps and figure it out and without dealing with that bigger picture. And to me, they need that kind of direction, right? Because they're not connecting it to the larger story or the larger context. There is a structural assault afoot,
Absolutely.
Right? With that in mind, the murder of Nipsey Hussle, right? And for those who may not know, Nipsey Hussle is a famous rapper, or he wasn't as famous or as commercial, but he was famous within the hip hop community, particularly the gangster rap community, right? And he was murdered a few weeks back, about a month now. In a very gruesome way, right? And a number of news stations were carrying it, CNN, MSNBC, particularly given the graphic nature in which he was murdered, right? But nonetheless, the murder of Nipsey Hussle, great loss to many in the hip-hop community, definitely the black community. Let's take a real-time example. What role could restorative justice play in the loss of this hip-hop artist, within the hip-hop community, but also within the black community, and also, right, he was a Crip, so within the street or gang community, right? And they are reeling, right, because he was really one of those figures in LA that a lot of people loved, right? And because of that, ironically enough, I think the communities are kind of coming together. But if you could, right, if you had the opportunity, the resources, how would you implement your restorative model, in Los Angeles at this time?
Yeah, I mean, admittedly, right? So I can't claim a lot of familiarity with Nipsey, right? And at the risk of doing what we saw and witnessed so many do, and that is claim that which they've never even understood, right? So we got cats that attended, funeral and just, they, didn't even pronounce his name right and kept saying, Nipsey Russell and you know what I mean, and the cat from the Wiz and all of that. So. So at the sake of doing that, right, I would say that what we saw emerge in Nipsey, though, is in many ways the with box, right? Because what he did, right, he was deeply and profoundly connected to his community, right? That in his funeral, his wife, right? His widow shouted out LA, right? You know what I mean? So deeply and profoundly connected to his community, right? You see blue all throughout the length and breadth of his funeral, right? So deeply connected and challenged, right? And challenge his community to do better, right? Challenge those, right? Blue and red, right? Figure out ways in which we can come together, right? So what I think we see, right? And I don't want to sort of, superficially steal something and fit into a model, but I think we see is sort of that with box in action, right? That high challenge, that high connection, right? What we see is others not necessarily pushing and challenging enough. We see others that are not connected at all, right? But what we see in him, and the reason why I think he was so beloved by the people is because he existed more in that with box, right? Yeah. And so how do we extrapolate that model, right? And say, okay, how can we challenge each other and connect to each other? So of course, the idea of, blue and red coming together and others, right? Sort of decentralized, street organizations coming together in order to connect, right? I mean, this is what we've been pushing for many years, right? We're all in the same gang and all of this, right? Is this idea of connection, right? And then inside of that connection to figure out how we can challenge each other so that we do it internally so that external forces don't have to, because we know that they've never been good at it anyway, because that was never their agenda, right? Right? And so I think that for me, that's really where we go. There's a book called Why Honor Matters, and it's by a philosopher out of the University of Houston, Tamler Sommers. And what he talks about is what restorative justice, restorative practices can do is allow us to operate in the space of honor, right? So when I'm engaged in restorative practices and a restorative conversation, then what I'm really doing is showing up with my authentic self, saying exactly what needs to be said on my heart and on my mind. Right. And I'm not cowtailing, I'm not speaking under my breath, I'm having the courage to be able to do that, whether I'm a victim or an offender, right? Whether I've caused harm or have been harmed. That's a space of honor. Right. What we need for our brothers in street level organizations to do is be able to be in a space where they can speak with honor, with their words, right, and their heart, and not necessarily with other tools and weapons.
Nice, nice. My final question. So I definitely want you to talk about your concept of the circles, right, and how that fits within your model. But also, right, if you can briefly, in addition to talking about the circles and the story of Maria and how you established the concept of a virtual circle.
Yeah. So circles, I think, are really easy for us to understand because they are the most ancient democratic structure that our ancestors gave us, right? Think about it. There's no more democratic way to share warmth around a fire than a circle, right? So circles have been around since humans have been around. And so it is the most common way in which we come together. So if you are with 3 or 4 of your friends and you go into an event, you find yourself standing in a circle. Right? If we see circles existing in religious institutions, right? The prayer circle, right? Native American Catholic prayer circle. You see it in Mormon traditions. You got Muslims circumnavigating around the Kaaba, right? Yeah. We see this if you go into any cafeteria with young people. You will see if one person really has something interesting to say, even if they're at those funky rectangular tables, you will see other young people sort of bending their bodies over to form a circle. Yeah. So circles are just part of how we do this thing called living, right? And so how do we activate the circle, put some things inside of it so it actually can be restorative, so it can resolve some of our challenging issues? And that's what we really are trying to do with restorative practices, right? Is use the vehicle of the circle by which to do that. And so in the book, I talk about there was a staff member that had lost her home to a fire, I think it was. And we needed to wrap our arms around her. But what we were doing immediately, sort of in our response, our hearts were telling us to just do whatever we could for her. And so we found ourselves dipping into that 4 box, that high connection, but really no challenge. And the problem is that we had stolen her voice. She was not even there to tell us what her needs were. Right? And so what we did was we created a virtual circle. We had 6, 7, I don't even remember how many staff members sort of got on the conference call. We did those initial things that we do in a circle called connection before content. And then we really opened the floor for Maria to be able to let us know how she was doing, for her to hear how we were feeling and thinking about what was going on. So miles and thousands of miles away, we created a virtual circle for Maria in order to feel connected. And she shared that that's exactly what she needed. She didn't need money. right? She had family, she was taken care of, she didn't need someone to come and take care of her children. What she needed was to know that people were thinking about her and caring about her at the time, right? And so that was really powerful. So we use the circle as an important process.
Yeah.
Something that I'll talk about in the next book is, if circles have been around since as long as people have been around, then circles really, have their foundation and origin in African people.
Yes, sir.
Right?
Yes,
And
sir.
so if that's the case, then what we ought to probably not try to do is try to bring the circle to communities of color, but rather have a little bit of humility, right? And I'm cite Kendrick Lamar, sit down, be humble, right? That what we probably need to do is have a little bit of humility and come to communities of color and see if we can find the circle there.
That's right.
And so when we look at our boys of color, our black and brown boys in an urban context, they have a circle. We don't see it as such, but it's called the cipher. Right? And if you really understand the norms of a cipher, then that is a very powerful circle. If you don't know what a cipher is, look it up, C-I-P-H-E-R. There's a good library around here somewhere that'll be able to give you some information about a cipher, right? And if not, then just YouTube. But the cipher is a really powerful way. So
Yes,
I break that down in the next book, We Can Save Our Boys of Color, really thinking about how can the cipher really be a site, right, of restoration. As you use the term, site of resiliency, right?
sir.
How can it be a site of restoration that's
Yes,
rooted inside of the people?
Nice, man, nice.
Yeah.
Let's give Dr. Muhammad a nice warm round of applause. Powerful, brother, powerful.
Thank you, thank you.
Definitely. Make sure to get this book. We're going to open up for Q&A. Do you want to just mention real briefly how they can get a copy of this book outside of going over there to get a copy of the book, but
Yeah.
let's say online, or let's say they want to get some other folk to support who is not in this room?
Absolutely. So, so we do have some books, some copies in the back, so you can get that and pick your copy up today. And I think we'll probably have some time to sign some. But it's also available on Amazon, and if you give us a week or two, it'll be available on Barnes and Nobles as well. So they reached out to us.
Nice.
One of the best things besides hanging out in Cuba with my wife, which was pretty amazing, y'all, right? Is while we're there, we get an email, and it's from Barnes and Noble asking us to have copies there. So that was pretty cool.
Wow,
So
wow.
not as cool as Cuba with my wife, y'all, but it was all right. So yeah.
Cool, cool, cool. Let's open it up for Q&A. Do we have a microphone? Oh, there we go. Cool, cool, cool. Questions, thoughts, answers, concerns? Yes.
Something that I've kind of been going back to throughout this talk was your quote about how connection plus challenge equals change, which I think is really interesting. But also, I go back to this idea or this fact that 85% of teachers in black and brown communities are white women. And that's a field that I'm interested in going into. So I guess I'm curious how, because, you also talk about how race kind of not inhibits connection, but plays a big role in connection. So what's your advice for teachers, white women who want to work in these communities, to how to make connections?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one that I get often, right? And I would say that there's probably three things, right? I would say, so I'll start with a good book to read is by Chris Emdin, right? For white folks that teach in the hood and the rest of y'all, right? So Chris has written a brilliant book, right? And I think it's a really good place. The works that he cites there. So I would say start with you're at the academy, right? So start with understanding, right, some of the challenges and things that you need to navigate in that space. Coming in with an open heart and an appreciation, right, for the culture of those students that you will serve. And what Aaron says so well is also recognizing that you're not going to know all about all, right? That you're going to stumble along the way, right? The second thing is that when I say connection plus challenge equals change, right, then I'm not talking about it being one directional. Your connection to the young people that you will serve will challenge you, and that will change you. That you will learn as much from them, probably if not more, right, that you will learn from them, that they will learn from you. So a really good example is there's a teacher in one of our alternative schools that came through some of the elite private schools in Delaware. Her father was a judge. And I happened to be in the cafeteria after school, and I'm sweeping because our custodian isn't there. And so she comes into the staff area, and she doesn't see me. And she opens up the refrigerator, and I hear this middle-aged white woman saying, "Damn, somebody beat me for my soda." That's trifling, right? Now, I'm going to code switch and translate for you here, if you don't mind, brother, right?
Yes.
So what she was, it was a, damn, right? That was a, an exclamatory statement, right? Someone beat me for my soda, right? What she was saying is someone had come in, unbeknownst to her, and had stolen her beverage of choice from the refrigerator, right? And had taken that and consumed it herself. And then she said, "That's trifling," which I can't even explain, right? It's so culturally rich that I don't even know how to spell it. It's just spelled many different ways, right? So I'm not even going to try to explain it, right? It's just one of those things. But here was this middle-aged white woman speaking a language that is not her native tongue, right? And by virtue of her proximity to those individuals, she was alone in her private moment, right? Not having anyone else around. And those are the words that came out of her mouth, right? She was a product of the relationship in which she was engaged in with these young people. They had been changing her and gave her this beautiful, expressive language as she was trying to teach them royal English, right? Third thing is, an African proverb is, one does not abandon their part of the battlefield just because it has thorns, right? If you find yourself in a space where you're serving children that are not seemingly having very much in common with you, that is your part of the battlefield. Don't abandon it just because it has thorns. And then go out, actively out, and try to recruit some teachers of color, because damn no.
All right.
Does that make sense? Right? Yeah. Sure.
I think they want you to do it because you're being recorded. Yeah.
Here it comes.
Thanks. So, you talked a lot about making connections with youth, people who are vulnerable. Some of us might consider them victims. How would you connect with an oppressor if you came by one? And how would you challenge them to overcome their racism or whatever?
Man. Yeah.
Bias, let's say.
Yeah, right. So, did you give him that question, man? Because that's
No, I
a,
did
man,
not,
woof. Yeah, how does one connect with an oppressor, right? It's hard because I am steeped in sort of this, militant, Pan-African, revolutionary mindset, right? And also, I default into the two box of, high challenge and very little connection, right? So that question is particularly challenging for me. But what I have been coming to terms with is that human beings are not made once and for all, right? And that as such, we all find ourselves on the journey. For instance, Malcolm X was in many ways, while a product of certainly of structural violence, he was in many ways a scourge to his community in many ways, right? And then Malcolm transforms and emerges in a very different way. I am not suggesting at all that I'm going to spend 1 ounce of my time in the rehabilitation of neo-Nazis, right? I'm not, that's just not my part of the battlefield, right? And if they're going to live in our community, and I'm not talking about just neo-Nazis, but those that are dyed in the wool, really, oppressing our community, if they're going to live in our community, then what are the systems and structures that we need to have in place so that we can limit the amount of harm that they do, and that their process does not continue to cause harm among the rest of us, right? And so I am not admittedly well suited for the engagement with those that are actively involved in the oppression of people, especially those that I feel are marginalized. I want to stand as someone who is a hero and a freedom fighter for those folks. So I'm still on my journey with that one, to just be perfectly honest. Yeah.
Can I add to answer his question a little bit? Since I do practice the restorative circle and practice in my building, I have a group of students who we do the circle with, and it's about 16 male boys, and I have 2 who are, of white culture, and the rest of African American. And I have 1 student in that group who is very pro-white, doesn't include himself with any of my other students, who I feel like I'm touching him in some ways, like he is, I don't want to answer this question, this doesn't apply to me. Like when we do our circles, like our kids are talking about things that they're going through because they're really open in that session, and he's really like non-compliant. Like, I don't want nothing to do with this. This doesn't apply to me. He's not my peers, because his dad's like a judge, and he's like, I don't even need school. I'm well off. I'm gonna be okay. I'm gonna do everything I need to do. I don't need to do this stuff. But me being who I am and how I connect with all my students, I feel like at the end of the day, I have touched him some kind of way. Like when he walks out that building, and it could be 20 years from now, I still feel like at some point, he got something of it.
Yeah.
So, just
well, I think you raise a good point. So I often quote Trevor Noah when he said that, bias doesn't hold up well to proximity. Right? And I thought that was brilliant, right? That bias doesn't hold up well to proximity, except I want to put a little asterisk next to that, right? Is it depends on the type of proximity, right? Because again, connection plus challenge equals change. Proximity could just be connection, right? For instance, my brother lived in rural Iowa, right? What my brother existed for those who were his friends was the good black guy, right? And so he had proximity, but they continued to still have bias. But what the kind of thing that you're talking about with your students is that connection, he's in the circle, plus challenge, right, equals change. So what is the proximity that we're going to have, right? It needs to be enlivened by this level of challenge as well. So if you're going to be here, then what does being here look like, right? What are the accountability pieces that we're going to put in place in order for you to be here and be in good standing with us? Right? And I think that that's the power of the circle. It's not just them there in place, but it's actually that if you're going to be here, this is what it means to be here. Yeah. There it is. There it is. Yeah.
All right, so I'm a policy guy. So I do evaluation and kind of and I'm more kind of, when you talk about SB 85, which is actually where I'm going. So to preface the question, when you were talking about metrics, it kind of resonated with me. But in the restorative work that you're trying to do, like, I'm a firm believer that part of making the systemic change that you're talking about is finding avenues within the existing structure to kind of create more pathways, or at least expand the lane a little bit. So how do you measure something like restorative practice or restorative justice?
Yeah, so we're having this conversation internally. It's a pretty intense one inside of our organization. And in my view, like most things, is a pretty passionate one, right? And that is that what I've said is, I'm not interested in creating good work that is easy for researchers to measure. I want researchers to up their damn game so they can measure the stuff that we really need, right? And so fine tune and develop your processes, right? So that you can measure and capture the good work that we're doing, instead of let's figure out, for instance, I think it is dishonorable to deny young people an intervention for the sake of creating a control group. Right? I think this, I know it's cute, it makes sense if you're trying to go for grants, but I'm trying to save lives, right? And so how can we create metrics that matter, right? And so obviously we need to delve heavy into, qualitative research, mixed methods, right? But there's some that are doing some of that, especially for some metrics that matter for those that are giving money, right? So for instance, the RAND, Foundation just completed a really big study in Pittsburgh schools, and you've got Ann Gregory, who's a professor and researcher out of, I think, Rutgers in New Jersey, that's doing some work. Katrina Morrison right here out of University of Delaware. Raise your hand, Katrina. is doing some really cutting edge work right around building some metrics around student voice in this. I would say also, though, to borrow some language that we see out in the business world, is leading indicators versus lagging indicators, right? All we're seeing with the metrics around restorative practice, restorative justice is lagging indicators. The number of decrease in office referrals, the number of in-school suspensions going down, number of out-of-school suspensions going down, et cetera, right? What we also need is leading indicators to talk about implementation. I'm really interested in knowing how many circles students are engaging in or leading, right? I'm really interested in how is your use of affective language really changing your own practice, right? So really those leading indicators that will level into those lagging indicators. We haven't perfected, right, how to measure restorative practices yet, right? And part of it is just because it's so steeped into relationships, right? It's, for instance, one of my favorite questions is, well, how long does this take? How long is it going to take for a kid to be restored, right? And I always respond with, hey, listen, how long does it take for someone to fall in love? Right? It really depends, right? What we do know is we've got those core ingredients: connection, challenge, relationships, et cetera, accountability. Yeah.
And if I may just piggyback off of that, so I definitely agree. And one thing I think researchers, right, scholars don't do well, right, and it's been written a lot about in the social science literature, we don't measure culture well, right? We don't really know how to do that. We actually fall apart. We do behavioral or racial outcomes. We can do that well. Race is not culture in and of itself,
Yep.
right? So leading scholars have been writing a long time about that, and as Dr. Muhammad has been saying, successful restorative models are based on relationships. Well, we're talking really about culture, and so that means to really have a positive impact in these communities and or with these persons, you're going to have a superior level of cultural competence, right? Which is, part of the problem with teachers coming in who are outside of the community, right? And schools too, right? For what it's worth, we don't know how to prepare young people to be educators that understand culture. We can teach you to teach math in and of itself, 2 + 2.
That's right.
But we don't really know how to teach you to go into a place like Wilmington, Delaware, in a poor black school and really understand how to teach that child as a function of culture. Keep in mind, learning is cultural, so you will have, an uphill battle, so to speak. But that's, I would agree completely. That's part of the reason why.
Well, and also, and here's a plug I think you'll appreciate is I believe that the way forward with research and restorative practices must be married to participatory action research.
Yes, sir.
Right?
Yes,
If restorative practice is about relationships, if it is about connection, then what better way to exemplify that than those that are in the process are actually researching themselves, right. i.e. street level par, right?
Right.
So for researchers to come in that are not engaged in the process is either 2 or 4, or maybe not, right? But really to be embodying that with box, then what we really need are those that are experiencing the process, are really helping to understand and examine themselves. We know it can be done because we've seen it done.
Yes, sir.
Right?
Yes, sir.
Because we've seen it
Yes,
done.
sir.
So, yeah.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so thank you very much. And also for building from what you were talking about, more than a question, if you have some advice, let's say that you're a young teacher and you're working at a school and the administration doesn't help you, or
Yes.
it's very, very toxic, and let's say that you're just a little person there and you're really trying to work really hard, but no one else is helping you. So do you have any advice?
Yeah, so we find this a lot. When you look around your circle of colleagues, and you seem to be the only one that is a champion for equity or a champion for restorative practices or trauma-informed care, what I would challenge you to do is look at those other adults as challenging students, right? And I'm not trying to say and demean them in any way, right? But what is a challenging adult who's like, no, I'm all about punishment and this is the way that I want to be, but a recalcitrant young person, right? In many ways. So if you are going to apply a restorative approach to young people, right, who's 12 years old, then how about to one who's 32 years old, right? And so really approaching them with a level of humanity, connection, challenge, change, right? And then at the end of the day is we all have to figure out what is our line that we're going to take a stand.
That's right.
Right? All of our greatest heroes and sheroes have always stood for something.
Yes, sir.
What is the courage, the reservoir of courage that you are going to dip into in order to say, this is where I'm going to make my stand, this is important enough.
That's right.
You know? And then, of course, teachers, just keep in mind that you're in high demand. So if you lose your job in one district, just go to another.
Oh, Jesus.
You'll be all right. You'll be all right, right? And what you also need to do is be a part of a collective, be a part of a tribe that will provide you with the cover and the sanity to let you know that you are not a lone wolf in the world, right? That there are people that also believe in what you believe in. It is critically important. Kwame Nkrumah says that one of the greatest enemies to the revolutionary is isolation. So you must break yourself out of isolation and make sure that you're around a circle of people that are also progressive in thinking like you are. That will challenge you as well.
And so that ties absolutely right to the question that I have. So earlier you talked about the tendency of when you're working in some schools that some take a very transformational approach to implementing restorative practices. Some take a kind of skim the surface approach to it. We have to do this, checkbox, sort of approach to it. I'm at Delaware State University. I'm really excited. Thank you for this. I'm excited to talk to my faculty more about this. And so in my role, one of the things that I'm trying to make sure that we're really committed to with the students at Del State is to make sure that we're not only preparing them with the right best practices, such as this, but the reality is that many times they may go in particularly committed and ready and even skilled with these best practices. What I'm wondering, and my question is tying back to that point about schools that are skimming the surface. It's a checkbox thing, but we want teachers that are making a difference for children. What do you recommend to the young people in this room, the young people I go back to and talk to at Delaware State University, that helps them navigate a culture that doesn't exist? Because if it's about relationships and connections, that's culture.
That's right.
And you can certainly set that culture in your classroom. It's sometimes hard to navigate this in any years of experience as an educator, but especially in the beginning years. What advice would you give to these emerging teachers on how they navigate a culture that's not in place when they're trying to make a big difference themselves?
Absolutely. So again, I would say you must be connected to a tribe, right? That you because that isolation will have you really thinking that others aren't also fighting the same fight. And they're just one school over, but you just don't know, right? So I think there's that. I think there's also a space where if districts are saying this is where we want to go, right, then they have now created the space by which you can begin to call them on their stuff, right? So for instance, I was in a school in Maryland, and the district had said, we want to be restorative, that we are going to move in this direction, but yet none of the district staff themselves have been trained, right? Which mean that they're largely in the moment in a space of compliance. So folks in the school, in school sites, are actually moving along this work, and they're really finding resistance at the district level. Well, this is a perfect moment for you to really call them on their stuff, right? To say, well, you're saying that you're about this, and now we want to hold people accountable at the school site, and then also at the district level too, right? And then we all need cover. And a good friend of ours, Charles Batten, talks about this a lot, right? Like, we all need to have some cover, and this is where you reach out to organizations like ours to be able to, provide some of the cover at the school level, at the district level, to be able to support in that way, But I would really say that the key is really make sure that you do not find yourself isolated, because that is going to be your sanity and your well to really feel that that your cup continues to get filled.
If I may, one of the things Malik said to me early on, I don't know if you remember, it was zebras. It was about zebras.
Yeah.
Right? And when zebras run in a pack, you can't find just one zebra, right? And it's always stuck with me. And I've always thought about finding my zebras in this work. So many of my zebras are in the room here tonight, so thank you all so much. Thank you all so much for coming out, and please join me in thanking Dr. Muhammad and Dr. Payne.